This is episode 86 of the Rio Grande Foundation's Tipping Point, New Mexico podcast. I'm Paul Gessing.
And I'm Wally Drangmeister.
I'm president of the Rio Grande Foundation, New Mexico's free market think tank. You can find out more about the foundation at riograndefoundation.org. This and every week we'll be talking to you about public policy issues facing New Mexico. Wally, as usual, especially now, we're past the session, but things keep happening and public policy keeps getting made, most of it bad here in the land of enchantment. And specifically, I'm referring to last night's Albuquerque City Council meeting at which a plastic bag ban was passed in Albuquerque. Although the plastics ordinance, as originally formulated, was changed somewhat so that restaurant clamshell containers, put your delicious red chili enchiladas or whatever in those, that was pulled out, as well as the ban on straws, plastic straws at least. So we are heading into a brave new world in Albuquerque starting January 1, 2020, when this law fully takes effect.
Yes, and these are just a long series of progressive initiatives that are emotion-driven, and I think they are starting to fall under the category from the progressive governance model. Is if they'll go for this, they'll probably go for something more in the future that is even more substantive and probably more damaging. And these things seem to be endless. And so, yes, no plastic bags from grocery stores coming up soon, and that will, according to the sponsors, it will just save our environment and be a win-win-win. No cost to this, no negatives. Everything's coming up roses. So. Great job.
Exactly. Well,
but there is another side, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. No. A few points to make about the meeting, and I was in attendance along with Wally's wife there, Carol White, who heads up the Restaurants Association in New Mexico. Councilors Benton, Borrego, Davis, and Gibson were the ringleaders of this legislation. They stuck together. They wanted the whole enchilada, so to speak. They wanted all plastics banned in Albuquerque. So they were hardcore supporters of the ordinance all along. Ken Sanchez wound up being the swing vote. It's noteworthy that Clarissa Pena, South Valley councilor, was not in attendance at last night's meeting, so it wound up just being 8 folks, but 8 was enough to get the job done for supporters of the plastic bag ban. The Republicans, Brad Winter, Trudy Jones, and Don Harris all held firm against it, so that's something to take home, at least considering that in the past they've jumped upon some pretty bad policy initiatives, including most of them on a tax increase about a little earlier than this last year, when only Brad Winter stood against raising taxes. Ken Sanchez is the one who kind of led the effort on the amendments, and the four horsemen of the apocalypse, so to speak, Benton, Borrego, Davis, and Gibson, they all expressed some frustration and desire to have the full ordinance put into place, but they went grudgingly along with Ken Sanchez. So who knows, maybe look for a left-wing, well, I guess he's actually had left-wing opposition, but Ken Sanchez is a moderate Democrat. I think he really did this for electoral reasons. I think personally he's not especially excited about the plastic bag bans and doing this kind of thing, but he sees the political writing on the wall. Right before the meeting, there was a study released by the city. It had some good information in it. Notably, it pointed out that the volume of material with a plastic bag ban will actually rise when paper bags replace plastics. It misguidedly rated plastic bags as zero in terms of recycling, that basically none of them are recycled, and that's just flat out wrong. I saw recent studies saying that 7.5% of plastic bags are recycled. Now, that's not done through the city. Plastic bags, don't stick them in your blue bin. In fact, they cause problems for the machinery at the recycling center, but people can bring them to, your local Walmart or Smith's or whatever grocery store and stick them in the bins they have, and they will be recycled. And evidently the process, unlike with the city, a lot of recycling is actually done of the plastic bags. But more importantly, the whole idea of reusing those plastic bags was completely lost upon the city's study authors. And I think that's where so many of these bad ideas are coming from, is that there's just non-analysis of the fact that these plastic bags are incredibly useful around the house for picking up pet waste, for using for trash cans, and all kinds of other purposes that, no, ultimately they're not recycled, but reused. And you're not going to recycle anything after it comes in contact with pet waste. And you're not going to get something that's being used to store trash recycled as well. So a disappointing day or evening for advocates of personal liberty and people's ability to make decisions for themselves. And it is worth noting one other thing, Wally. I don't know if Carol had any thoughts on this. The thing that, as the parents of 3 small children, that really kind of got to me is just how much fear some of these kids, because there are a lot of kids presenting at city council, and how much fear over the environment in the future that these kids have been pumped full of. Now, I don't know if it's the parents, the school system, or some combination thereof, but to hear these kids tell this plastic bag ban is going to solve global warming and all kinds of other issues, but more importantly, they think that the world is going to come to an end within their lifetimes. And it just seems that somebody is just misleading these children and scaring them. And kids are impressionable. There's even adults nowadays who are young who are saying, I'm not going to have kids because of the environmental impact and the global warming. And Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the congressman, left-wing socialist, is saying similar things. And it's just really sad and frustrating to me as somebody who ultimately, despite New Mexico's many misguided public policy efforts, is optimistic about the future of humanity, the future of this country, and really just disturbing to hear that kind of rhetoric coming out of 8 and 9-year-old kids' mouths.
Well, when I see the children up there, it reminds me of basically the Great Leap Forward, Chairman Mao's campaign in the late 50s and early 60s, and the use of youth as a spearhead for those initiatives, in terms of that. And I don't think that's real good company to be in. And so obviously these children aren't coming to these conclusions themselves in terms of what's important, what's not, the analyzing risk. And I think that it is a very dangerous thing. I mean, I think that's also the can contribute to horrible things like this hopelessness and not valuing the individual and all the horrible things that happen when that happens. So yeah, it is more than just a little disturbing. And when you're using 4th graders for economic and industrial and business policy, you're probably not getting things that are optimized from a effectiveness point of view, albeit the other side sure likes that from a political point of view.
No doubt about it. Well, we're talking about city policy here in New Mexico, and we're going to hop on I-25 in our electric vehicle or whatever it might be and head down the road to Las Cruces, where it's very rare to hear a local business owner in any city in New Mexico, because normally they're trying to just keep afloat, avoid controversy with these progressives in charge, and really just not make a lot of waves. But a gentleman named Dave Hooker, who is a business owner in Las Cruces, wrote a opinion piece that was published in the Las Cruces Sun News on April 7th of this month here, so April 7th, very recently. And he went after Las Cruces city government pretty hard in terms of talked about sewer and water fees, those going up. He talked about impact fees and the difficulty for businesses to expand when you have additional fees placed on businesses trying to do that. Gross receipts tax rate in Las Cruces is 8.3125, so really a high rate on the gross receipts tax, making business very difficult. And of course, as we at the Rio Grande Foundation say every time we talk about the gross receipts tax, it is not a sales tax. It impacts businesses far more profoundly than does a traditional sales tax. And then he talked about the minimum wage. So, and then finally he listed 40 some odd businesses in Las Cruces that have closed or gone out of business in recent years. So this guy, Dave Hooker in Las Cruces, was really singing from the Rio Grande Foundation playbook. And I ultimately wrote a letter to the editor in the Las Cruces Sun News to buttress many of his comments. But as we always do, we try to bring some data into the equation. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics provides annual job growth numbers by metropolitan areas. And we looked at, you could look at, there's probably 8 or 9 cities in Colorado, a couple dozen in Texas. We just used the average jobs data for cities in Colorado, Texas, Arizona, Utah, and then looked at individual cities here in New Mexico. Now, Colorado was, over the last year, 1.9%, Texas 2.2%, Arizona 2.7%, and Utah 2.8%. So it was Santa Fe at 1%. So about half the job growth rate of the lowest neighboring state. Las Cruces was at 0.7%, so not as bad as Albuquerque at 0.5%, but not as good as Santa Fe. And then poor Farmington, and you and I, Wally, we've talked extensively about the challenges of the Four Corners region. Farmington is suffering from systematic changes to its economy that are really not much they can do about them. They saw a decline of 0.8 percentage point in terms of jobs between February 2018 and February 2019. So Dave Hooker is onto something. I don't know that he'll get through to the progressives in control of Las Cruces city government, just like those who support bag freedom in Albuquerque lost out to the progressives that got elected into Albuquerque City Council. But Las Cruces is yet another place where they're struggling to be a business-friendly city, and unfortunately not succeeding in that regard.
Yeah, and when minimum wages were raised in Santa Fe, Albuquerque, Las Cruces, there's always it is not going to cause any damage. It's not going to cause any damage. And when we look back now, a decade later in some of these communities as how they are doing, I don't think you can lay all of this on their previous minimum wage issues. There's all the other ones we talked about. In my case, I particularly think the gross receipts tax is extremely damaging for business formation and business growth in New Mexico. But these things are coming together, so we have this scoreboard that we continually do pour on as a state relative to our neighbors and surrounding areas. And these are the up times, hugely uptime. Economies are growing as rapidly as they have in many, many years all around us. And New Mexico is just limping along, which brings the issue up to me is what happens if we do get an economic slowdown and we have all these very costly policies that really are so damaging to the formation and growth of businesses. What's it going to happen then? Are we going to have to double down, which is raise taxes in a down economy? And you can only do that a few times, and you end up like Detroit, Michigan, or other places that have suffered basically economic collapse. So we are in a very tenuous place here from business policy in New Mexico right now.
No doubt about it. And you're right, Wally. New Mexico had been struggling mightily, really up until very recent times. So we're talking January of 2018, and things started to turn around as Trump took office, and really the energy prices started to come back around, and production, as we've talked about in the oil patch in the Permian Basin, has rebounded dramatically. But the state did a lot of harm, the legislature in the last session. And we have cities continuing the drumbeat of bad policy out of Albuquerque and Las Cruces. Santa Fe, certainly they're doing their things. They're not without blame in Santa Fe by any stretch of the imagination. It actually is more that Albuquerque and Las Cruces are moving in the direction of Santa Fe very quickly from a policy perspective. And of course, Santa Fe has had a plastic bag ordinance on the books for some time. It's still more aggressive in Albuquerque than it is in Santa Fe. But talking about trends, and this kind of dovetails nicely with a new report put out by the American Legislative Exchange Council, Rich States, Poor States. And they do this report every year. My good friend Jonathan Williams at ALEC, Arthur Laffer, of course, most famous for the Laffer curve developed under Ronald Reagan. And they do a economic performance rank for the last decade, and then they do an economic outlook rank that they see for each state going forward. But I have to admit that I think the performance rank of the past really says a lot more than a prospective speculation on the part of these guys, as talented as they are. And the retrospective is not good for New Mexico. They give us an overall ranking, and you can find this report just alec.org, ALEC.org. We'll be posting a link to it on the Foundation's website as well, arrowsoфenchantment.com. We're 47th overall in economic performance in New Mexico over the last decade. The gross domestic product, so basically the size of the economy in New Mexico from 2007 to 2017, grew 16.9%, which sounds fine, but that ranks us 46th in the entire nation. Domestic migration, that's something where, again, New Mexico tends to outperform simply based on weather and geography in the southwest of the nation, but we're still only ranked 32. There are 31 more states that people are moving to besides New Mexico, and not all of them have better weather than we do. Then non-farm payroll employment, we actually saw a decline over the time frame 2007 to 2017 of negative, so a decline of 1.5%. That gives us an overall rank of 48th in the country. Now, you can go through Arizona, Colorado, Texas, Utah, Oklahoma, all those states. I can just say it clearly that each of them outperforms New Mexico in pretty much all three of those major metrics. But the fact is that we're actually retrospective, as I said. So the legislature was more slightly more centrist as opposed to progressive. Governor Martinez was doing the best she could over that 8 years to try to keep a lid on things. And now we've fully gone left-wing progressive. So I don't think the folks at ALEC took that into account when they did their ranking Mexico as 30th in economic outlook, because if they looked at who has come to power in New Mexico, they would see more clearly that this state is in for a bumpy ride policy-wise in the years ahead.
Well, a couple of points about this study, and I have it in front of me, is that the left wing absolutely hates ALEC for whatever reason. They tend to demonize them along with some of their other favorites. But when you look at the variables they use in these, there's nothing in here that strikes you as having even a mildly political bent when it comes to economics. It's things like property tax, sales tax burden, workers' compensation costs, things like that. It's very solid. And then the other point that I see from this, that this is a New Mexico issue, when they do non-farm payroll employment, and that's very common in economic analyses because farm payroll tends to be very volatile and really distorts trends, so they take that out of there. In the case of New Mexico, because we've been driven so much by energy, even with our massive success recently in energy growth, our overall employment growth is still very, very, very low. And I would love to see what that would these employment numbers would look like, energy versus non-energy. I think it probably tells a story that in much of the past several years, non-energy, non-farm employment has probably gone down in New Mexico, would be my guess. But again, your data, the great thing about the Rio Grande Foundation, you're data oriented, but I think there's some additional insights to be gained above and beyond this if we were to look into that, because there's nothing wrong with energy. It's wonderful for New Mexico, but as we all know, it's volatile, and the price can go very, very high very quickly, and it can go very, very low and change the dynamics that really impacts New Mexico. And so that's why focusing on those non-energy jobs is something that's also a very good scorecard, I think, going forward.
Energy is certainly a volatile sector, but also and I think this is a challenge for the state and its leaders and our economy moving forward, is that because energy, unlike so much of New Mexico's economy, operates in a market that is very competitive, the number of employees in the energy sector, that is traditional oil and gas, has been declining. You used to have a large number of people on each individual drilling rig, and that is shrinking as time goes on. Technology advances and attempts to cut costs, and that helps all of us out in the long term, but it definitely makes a difference when you look at the hiring roles and the amount of tax dollars and economic growth paid into the traditional economy. You still get plenty of money from the severance tax paid into the state, which isn't nearly as exciting for us at the Rio Grande Foundation. We definitely want to see, to the extent taxes are being paid by people taking jobs and working hard and earning those paychecks and staying put in New Mexico. Just the tribute to Santa Fe doesn't do a lot of good for anybody, despite all the nice rhetoric about how it funds our schools, and it does, but it ultimately, so much of that money is just is wasted by the government maw in Santa Fe and around our state. So, speaking of government waste, we've got the first $1 billion budget for city of Albuquerque, so that's the next step forward, and bad policy coming out of the Duke City. But I dug into the budget a little bit, specifically the mass transit budget. And of course, Wally, mass transit is something that we've always had real problems with, especially in a state like New Mexico that's so spread out, that is so unfriendly to mass transit in general. But Keller's budget increases transit spending by 8.7%. And in an article on Channel 13, the head of the transit department noted that in Albuquerque, the buses fare box ratio is the amount of money that customers pay in relative to the amount of money it costs to operate the system. In Albuquerque, the buses have a ratio of 7 to 10%. So people's fares, when they drop it in, account for about 7 to 10% of the operating cost. Now, if you have to buy a new bus, if you have to invest in some kind of capital, like a repair facility or something, that's a capital expenditure. That doesn't even count in this. So there's no way, people talk about, oh, we should privatize the rail runner, privatize the buses. Well, I'm sorry. The fact is that no sane business person would get into this line of work because it's a big money loser. And that's true really around the country, because as the head of the transit department, Mr. Toon, pointed out, the average around the country is about 30% of operating costs. So the fare box ratio is about 3 times higher. Just pick a city, random USA. It doesn't have to be New York or some big metro area. It could be just out any Orlando or some other random city. But it's just an amazing system here we have in Albuquerque, where we continue to spend more money on mass transit systems. The traditional buses operate but don't actually work. And then there's the ART, which doesn't operate or work. And we're just pouring more money after bad. It's just a very sad statement about the public policy mindset of people in Albuquerque and New Mexico in general.
Yes, and it is that is not all that surprising when you look around, just glancing in the buses that you see running much of the time. There's times during the commuting times where you see quite a few people on the buses, but much of the day those buses, including the large articulated buses, the double-length buses, are running around town with a couple people in them. And so that is not a surprise, but it is disappointing that we have a system that the value is so low to the ridership that only 7% can be recovered. So I'm not seeing anything nor heard anything about, hey, do we want to look at where our bus routes are and reconfigure that? It's just, no, let's add 6-7% more to the budget, and we'll just keep doing what we're doing.
Well, and as bad as things are in the city of Albuquerque with regard to its transit system, and of course ART notably and very much like a sore thumb just sticking out there waiting to eventually go into service, but still we've got at least another year before those buses start rolling down Central. The Rail Runner, a project that the Rio Grande Foundation has posed from day one. I looked at a report from the state that was published earlier this year and found that the fare box recovery ratio of the Rail Runner is 6%. That is abominable. It's pathetic. The total financing, and you can go again to heirsofenchantment.com. The title of the post is "Transit Finances Are Bad, Rail Runner is Even Worse," or Albuquerque Transit Finances. And then there's a pie chart showing that 6% of the revenue generated is from the fare box, 44% is gross receipts tax revenue, so the taxpayers of New Mexico, 44% is federal taxpayers, and the Rail Runner shockingly gets as much from BNSF and Amtrak, and that relates to the tracks themselves. They get 6% of their operations from the railroad, the private railroad that actually makes money, and the federal government's heavily subsidized railroad, Amtrak. So the rail runner, transit in Albuquerque, transit across the state, it just doesn't make money. The cities around here are way too spread out or too spread out from each other. Transit doesn't necessarily work that great in even major, relatively densely packed cities, but the best thing that New Mexico policymakers, state, local, whatever it may be, can do about most transit is just put them on a fast as possible path to just elimination. Just get rid of them because they are not working. They're not saving energy. They're not saving anybody money. They're just waste, and we don't need to keep spending more money every single year on them. And Wally, we have some late news here from the state of Illinois. And unfortunately, as is so often the case, we've got more bad news in the sense that this is another state following New Mexico down the path of bad public policy. In this case, the state of Illinois, which saw a local government adopt right to work. It was a township in Illinois, and that spurred the township. Actually, Lincolnshire Village is the name of it. And these people stuck their necks out on the local right to work issue. Unfortunately, the state of Illinois went fully blue, progressive. In the last election, their Republican governor, like New Mexico's, is gone. And without having some protection policy-wise at the state level, local governments are going to get their proverbial heads chopped off when it comes to policies like right to work fairly quickly. And that's exactly what happened is the local right to work initiatives in New Mexico were quickly eliminated by our legislature and our governor. And the same thing happened recently in Illinois. So unfortunate, not entirely surprising, but kind of similar situation out of Illinois to what we had in New Mexico.
Yes, and it is interesting that New Mexico tends to be policy-wise aligning itself very closely with those states that are struggling to keep population, losing business, having lower growth rates, California and Illinois, and this is another example of that.
You got it, Wally. And as an aside note, the article that I read from the Chicago Tribune on this particular issue noted that the state of Illinois had recently passed a $15 an hour minimum wage increase. It'll take effect by 2025. Now, New Mexico only went up to 12. Of course, this is a much lower cost, much poorer state than the land of Lincoln. However, when people think of Illinois, they may just think of Chicago. Well, Chicago is like New York City and like LA and San Francisco. It's a very big, powerful city and high cost city with a lot of lower cost regions. So if you go what they call downstate in Illinois to Springfield and some of these other areas, they will face serious problems in some of these less upscale towns around Illinois. So just a kind of an aside, you nailed it on the head there when you said that New Mexico is following Illinois or Illinois is following New Mexico. Who knows? We're both heading off the cliff. And if you want to check out Illinois in the Rich States, Poor States publication, Illinois is indeed one of the slowest growing, most economically challenged states in the country. So no surprise there. We know that we have these problems in New Mexico, and unfortunately, we're in lockstep in this case with Illinois, another state that is definitely struggling. So that's all the bad news we got this week, Wally.
Well, my final closing thought on all of this is that in you alluded to it with regard to Illinois, but I think it's huge in getting bigger and bigger in California and big in New Mexico is as damaging as a lot of these progressive policies are, they are more well suited for larger urban areas, are more easily able to withstand them. And they tend to be one size fits all. And in a place like Illinois, whatever's good for Chicago, that's the way the state goes. In New Mexico, it's Albuquerque, Santa Fe, and in increasing Las Cruces go this way. But the damage, I believe, that will be put upon rural economies in states with these policies is something to really keep an eye on, because that's going to be a huge issue in New Mexico, because we have a rural population spread over a large area, and they're not doing very well now. And to try to withstand these initiatives that are maybe bad in urban areas, they could be disastrous in rural.
No doubt about it. Yeah, we're going to see that for sure in New Mexico as the minimum wage goes up to $12 an hour by 2013. I don't really think the urban elected officials or urban populations, unfortunately, care all that much. Not only are those rural communities places where, frequently the big city folk don't travel. I travel especially a lot for my job at the Rio Grande Foundation. I probably know more about rural New Mexico than 99% of residents of Albuquerque, but they just also see them as political opposition. And that may not be true of the average voter, but certainly the average politician at the state level, the legislative level. What do they care if Farmington or Springer or Jowl or Grants or wherever are suffering? They have the votes in the city and they have the power. And by limiting the power of those rural areas, they're able to move their own agenda forward in a more specific fashion. So it's tough stuff here we're dealing with in the city of Albuquerque, in the state of New Mexico, city of Las Cruces as well. But we hope that we haven't depressed you all too much. We have a fun interview lined up this week with Dr. Dean Waldman. He's a pediatric cardiologist and an MBA, resident here of the city of Albuquerque. And that'll be a fun podcast on Thursday. And also, Larry Schweikert will be speaking about Ronald Reagan and his new book that he's written about Ronald Reagan and his presidency on May the 8th. So that's coming around the corner. Be sure to get your seat for Larry Schweikert's presentation. Go to riograndefoundation.org or arrowsoфenchantment.com, and that'll be a great discussion and great event. And Larry is a fun speaker. So thank you all for listening to this week's discussion. We are working every day to turn New Mexico around. Go to riograndefoundation.org for more information or to support our work.